Priority is another way that we manage ownership between targets. There are 10 levels of priority that a target can have. 1 is the lowest, and 10 is the highest. The default priority of targets is 4. Let's look at an example of how priorities function. So in live, I'm going to go to queue 28. And that's going to take my queue list 1 to its queue 28. And for this example, I'm going to go ahead and remove the hangs that are on my queue list 2. So let's go ahead and say queue 2/1 through 3. Shift delay twice will get us hang, enter, and that will remove those hangs for us. I'm also going to type 101 so we can watch those channels move. I'm going to hit go on my master fader set, and that will take me into queue 29. And if we look at my second queue list and I hit go, you'll notice that it was the latest target to give those channels move instructions, and so it takes over those channels. Again, if we hold about and queue, you'll see that those 5 channels are now owned by queue list 2, and all of the other channels remain owned by queue list 1. Let's hit go on our main fader into queue 30. And again, those channels move because we have move instructions in queue list 1 for those channels. If I hit go again on queue list 2, you'll notice that the intensities are still owned by queue list 1, but because we did a record only when we created queue list 2, there are only move instructions for my focus. And you can see that my other non-intensity parameters have tracked because queue list 1 has also not regained control. So ownership actually works on a parameter by parameter basis, not just channel by channel. If we want to ensure that queue list 2 is always going to take ownership of these channels, I can change its priority. So I'm going to go ahead and say QQ. And in my queue list index, I'm going to go ahead and put my priority of that queue list at 5. And any target with a higher priority is always going to gain control of the channels that it owns. I'm going to go back out in the live, and let's go back to the beginning, Q1/28 load. And I'm also just going to turn off our queue list 2 for this example. We can see when I hit go, about queue will show us that those are owned by queue list 1. And again, I'm going to hit go on my queue list 2. You'll see that asserts ownership, even when there are tracked values. And then I'll hit go on my main queue list again. And even though there are move instructions in queue 29 for those channels, because queue list 2 is active and the priority is higher, it retains ownership of those channels. Priorities can also work across other target types, such as submasters. So for this example, I'm just going to go on my main queue stack until I get into queue 32. And I'm going to use my sub 2, and as we expect, the sub is set for highest takes precedent. So the sub gains ownership of those channels as soon as the intensity is higher than what's stored. And of course, anything is higher than 0, so it gains control very quickly. But once it's down to 0, it tosses back control to the queue. If I have a priority that's lower than my queue list, then the sub will never be able to take control. Let's look at a quick example of that. So sub, I want to take my sub 2 and make it a priority of 3. And if we look back out in live, rolling that same sub up won't be able to gain control of those channels, and that's because the queue list is set to a priority of 4. If we go to queue out, nothing is active on stage, and you'll see that my sub works normally because no other content is holding those channels. When you're using queue lists, it's important to know that the queue doesn't take ownership of channels until the first move instruction of the list. So let's look at an example. You can see here my 51 through 59. I can still use my sub, even though it's at a lower priority. And as soon as I hit go onto Q2, there's a move instruction for channel 51. And because that channel is now owned, I cannot affect the level of that channel. Just so we're not confused for the rest of our time here, I'm going to go back into my sub 2 and set that priority back to 4 so that HTTP will be the determining factor as to who has ownership over these channels.